Welcome back to The Heat. US President Barack Obama will travel to Riyadh on Tuesday to pay his respects to the late King Abdullah and meet with the new King Salman. Saudi Arabia has been a key Arab ally of Washington and joined the US-led coalition last year, which is carrying out airstrikes in the fight against Islamic militants. Tensions flared between the two countries after the Obama administration refused to take action against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. There are also growing fears about a possible nuclear deal with Saudi rival Iran. Joining us now from Dallas is Robert Jordan. He served as the U.S. ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia following the deadly September 11, 2001 attacks on U.S. targets by Al-Qaeda. Also with us from London is Dr. Madawi Al-Rasheed. She is visiting professor of the Middle East Centre with the London School of Economics and Political Science. Thank you both so much for joining us. Let's start with you, Ambassador. You were there around the time of the September 11th attacks. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi Arabia. What a schism was this for US and Saudi Arabian relations, and have they recovered?
Well, first of all, I think Osama bin Laden tried to create a schism. Fortunately, we overcame it. When I arrived right after 9/11, many of the senior Saudis were in denial that it could have possibly been 15 of their own sons involved in these attacks. So we had to first convince them of the facts and what happened, and then we had to gain their support in going after Al-Qaeda. It took a couple of years for them to really get on board, but by the middle of that decade, they had really wiped out pretty much all of Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia. Sadly, they migrated to Yemen. But we really received terrific support ultimately from the Saudis, and I think they are a very strong partner now in going after all of the Islamic terrorists who are out there.
Dr. Madawi, you know, for outsiders, the Saudi-US relationship doesn't fit in with the sort of US model of talking about human rights and democracy. How do both Riyadh and Washington kind of square that?
I think it's a common interest. The U.S. has been supporting Saudi Arabia and guaranteeing the security of the regime since the 1940s, in fact, since the discovery of oil. And that was also a strategic relationship. Saudi Arabia, its geography, its location was extremely important during the Second World War. But after that, oil and geostrategic interests had made the two partners throughout the last half decades or more. But this doesn't mean that the relationship has always been harmonious. Of course, the two countries do not have a lot in common. And it is a joke when people say that the Americans and the Saudis have a lot of common values. In fact, there is just sheer interest that brings them together. But at the same time, there are schisms, and we saw how they could be materialized during times of crisis. So after 9/11, there was a tense relationship, but I think there are common interests on both sides of the relationship that kept it going against all odds, and against also the American constituency that has always questioned this relationship. America stands for the Americans, not necessarily for the rest of the world, as a country that supports democracy, that respects human rights, despite the setback that took place in America itself after 9/11. And therefore, the American administration, whatever its color, has always faced this contradiction in terms of its relationship with dictators in the Middle East and beyond, and a local constituency that calls upon the American people and the American leadership to honor its promise to uphold the values that America stands for. And this contradiction is apparent in the relationship between America and so many dictators in the Middle East, Mubarak of Egypt, the Saudi ones, and also the rest of the Gulf, not to mention in a previous era, for example, South America and Latin America.
Sure. I'm glad you mentioned interest there, because, Ambassador Jordan, we've seen a divergence of interest, especially in the last few years, haven't we, between Saudi Arabia and Washington. One thinks of the Arab Spring, the Obama administration saying go to Mubarak. That upset Riyadh. The refusal after promising to go after Assad in Syria because of chemical weapons uses. We could talk about differences, of course, with the Iran rapprochement potentially on the horizon. So where there has been this confluence of interest for decades, are the two now drifting apart, Ambassador Jordan?
At bottom, I think they are not. I think the major common interests still remain. Fighting terrorism, maintaining a stable price of oil, maintaining oil surge capacity in case of a worldwide crisis, and maintaining credibility in the Muslim world. All of these are fundamental national interests that we share. Yes, we do have differences in tactics. No ally shares exactly the same interests with another ally. But I think at bottom we have survived differences, and our common interests are really still pretty much the same.
You mentioned oil, though. There is a divergence over oil now as well, with the price plummeting below $50 a barrel. It's been framed, especially where you are in Texas, as a way to basically get rid of a lot of American production, which, of course, is much more expensive. We're talking about shale oil and fracking than it is in Saudi Arabia. So are we now seeing Saudi oil policy taking on American production for market share?
No, I don't think. I think the Saudis want to maintain their market share, and like any businessman would want to maintain his or her market share in whatever they're selling. They don't want to take oil off the market and then have competitors come in and take that market share or those customers away from them. But at bottom, the Saudis are not using oil as a political weapon here. I think they're not using it as a weapon to destroy competition so much as maintain their own market share. That's called national interest, as Dr. Madawi was saying a minute ago.
Dr. Madawi, what do you think about Saudi policy when it comes to religion? Because there has been a lot of criticism here in the United States about the exporting of Saudi interpretation of Islam, Wahhabism, and the fact that a lot of Saudi charities have been funding, willingly or not, Islamic groups from Syria and elsewhere. This is a potential problem between the two, who obviously want to fight terrorism as well.
Well, it is a serious problem, not only for the rest of the world, but for Saudis themselves. The Saudi regime itself cannot survive without Wahhabism because it provides it with a sense of legitimacy, a sense of raison d'etre. There is nothing else to rely on in order to domesticate the population and extract obedience from it. The Wahhabi tradition, above all, guarantees that Saudi citizens remain quiet. They do not go on demonstrations asking for their rights. They don't even go on Twitter. That's what the Wahhabi tradition wants them to do. And therefore, the Saudi regime uses Wahhabism, instrumentalize it in order to keep the population quiet, because it will inflict the wrath of God if they actually disobey their king. And therefore, this religious dimension is extremely important to pacify Saudis and inhibit any kind of mobilization on the ground, asking for human rights. So far, we have seen so many Saudis go to prison simply because they tweeted 140 letters to say that we would like to have an elected parliament. We would like to be represented in a national council like the rest of the world. We want to have an elected government. And the moment you do that, you have the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, the chief head of the Wahhabi tradition, say that Twitter is actually illegitimate and it spreads chaos and discord among the population. So there is one side to the Wahhabi tradition that inspires obedience to rulers, but there is another nasty side to this tradition that actually caused 9/11 and also continues to cause dissent and even violence in some parts of the world, when the Saudis prefer to have the Wahhabis that are not loyal to the Saudi king go and fight jihad, that is a struggle abroad, such as we have seen in Syria, such as we have seen in Saudi Arabia. But I think what the Saudi regime had done since 9/11 is to suppress this dissent at home and allow it to go abroad. And we have seen what they had caused in places like Iraq and Syria, and possibly in Yemen, not to mention in the West itself.
Robert Jordan, do you agree with that? And also, I'd like you to address this dichotomy that some people have felt in the West of praising the late King Abdullah as being a reformer. Does this sort of view that we've heard from Dr. Madawi fit with that?
Well, there are many paradoxes and contradictions in Saudi Arabia. Certainly the Wahhabi doctrine is one that I was concerned about during my time as ambassador and throughout the Bush administration. We tried to work with the Saudis to tone down some of the ideological extremism that we saw in the textbooks in the schools, in some of the outreach that they were undertaking throughout the world. There has been some progress, modest progress, I think, in that regard. King Abdullah was really trying to thread a needle, if you will. He had a preference for certain types of reform, allowing women, for example, to vote in municipal elections, to become participants in the Shura Council, which is not a really legislative body, but it's advisory. And so there were some reforms instituted. One of the most important ones, I think, was joining the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and enacting the legislation that required them to be part of the international economic community. This was something that I was very heavily involved in. And so you do have these contradictions. What I think we're seeing now is that since 1989 and the return of some of the jihadis from Afghanistan, the Saudis have realized that they had a real problem, and after 9/11, I think it became more apparent to them that they had to do something about it. They've moved forward against the militants within the kingdom, and of course now against ISIS and other figures in other neighboring countries. But there is still this ideological support that is out there that is very difficult for the leadership of Saudi Arabia by executive fiat overnight to tamp down.
One last question to both of you, because we are running out of time, but we now have King Salman on the throne. We have Crown Prince Mokrem, and now Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, of course, who was a strong man who went into Bahrain. What are we going to see in terms of continuity with US-Saudi relations, or is there going to be change going forward? Dr. Madawi first.
I think there wouldn't be any change, because Saudi Arabia is actually not a country of institutions. It's a country of princes. And therefore, the personalized relations that King Abdullah developed with the United States will continue during the time of King Salman, and will probably continue, most probably, in fact, certainly, will continue during the time of Mohammed bin Nayef. Simply as long as the Saudis threaten the world with this terrorism, as long as they position themselves as partners in fighting terrorism, then the West falls into this trap, very much like the British when they fell into it in the late 1920s, when the same Wahhabis who helped create Saudi Arabia turned against their king, Ibn Saud at the time, and then the British had to intervene, capture them, and give them to Ibn Saud. Right. And we're seeing the same scenario now.
Ambassador, what's your view? Continuity or change?
Largely continuity. I think King Salman will continue King Abdullah's policies. He needs to get to know President Obama during his visit tomorrow. I think Crown Prince Mokrem is also very Western. He is very technologically savvy. And of course, Mohammed bin Nayef will be a very strong figure in fighting terrorism in the region.
Ambassador Robert Jordan in Dallas and Dr. Madawi Al-Rasheed in London, thank you very much. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at cctv_America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.